Okay, now sometimes there is a need to get some data into your workflow quickly that you want to use for test purposes, or you may want to put a very small dataset in your workflow that doesn't exist in any format, other than on the back of a piece of paper. Now this is where the text input tool can help, and is the final method of data input we will explore. Now the text input tool is very basic in terms of how it's configured, so let's see it in action. So firstly, we will drag a text tool onto the canvas, which once again can be found in the In/Out tool category. Now let's assume you have mapping tables in Excel that you want to use in your workflow, but want the ability to change the mappings in Alteryx on the fly. Now I've created very simple mapping tables that I will use in this example, which show the city ID, the name of a city, and the city's population, as well as a second tab which shows some data on people. Now the configuration window of a text input tool allows us to import data via the import option. We can also copy data from the text tool and paste it outside of the text tool itself. And we can also use the paste option, which allows us to paste data in that we have copied onto the clipboard from another tool. Now let's first bring in the city table into the text tool by importing the file. So I can click on import, and I have a few options where I can import from, but in this example I will select file and then search for the file where the data resides. Once I've selected the file, I can pick the respective tab and then click OK. And there we have it. I now have a set of data in Alteryx via the text input sheet that I can now use in subsequent tools in the workflow. Now note here that when we import, the first row is considered as headers and the rest is data. If I now add a browse tool after the text input and run the workflow, the data is fed in like any other data source and we can now use it accordingly. Now a slightly different way of getting data into the text tool is by simply copy and pasting it from my file, but it has one noticeable difference. If I drag another text input tool onto the canvas and open up the Excel file example which contains the people data, I can select the data and press Ctrl+C, which will copy the data to the clipboard. And then I can go back into the text tool configuration window and click on the paste option. This copies the data into the text tool. However, notice that the row headers were also considered as data. Now this can be a pain if there are hundreds of column names, but seeing as we only have a small table, we can simply rename the columns manually to the correct headers by clicking on field 1, field 2 and field 3 names respectively and renaming them. Now obviously, seeing as we don't want the headers to be part of the data, we can also select row 1 and then click the delete option and then delete the row. Now if we wanted to add more data to our text input, we can use the insert option like so, where we can insert records to the bottom of our dataset, as well as picking where we want to insert data into our dataset, selecting the row and inserting a row accordingly. We can update the data that resides in the table by clicking on the cells that need changing and making the necessary changes. We can add columns of data by inserting columns just like we can with rows, and then providing the column with a name and adding the data accordingly. And if we add a browse tool after the text input and run the workflow, once again we have a set of data that we can now use in subsequent tools. Now we can also take data from the text input tool and copy it elsewhere. So if I were to select the top left of the table and select copy, I can paste it to a program such as Excel to then use in other processes if required. And just for completeness, I can also copy and paste selected rows of data from the text input tool into Excel like so. So the text tool is a very useful tool if you want to get some data into your workflow in a manual way, as you can start a dataset completely from scratch by creating columns of data and then adding the data to it yourself. Data can also be imported from a file or copied from a file and pasted in accordingly, ready to be used in the next stage of the workflow.